Hello and welcome to Unit 3 in our Modern Latin American History class. In this unit, our guiding question is the one that you see below. How did the competing forces of caudillo rule, liberal conservative, church disputes, and racial difference shape the process of mid-19th century nation building? So we're going to cover a lot of ground in this unit in terms of chronology. We're starting roughly at 1850 and we're working to the turn of the 20th century. The big topics that we'll be looking at in the Chasteen textbook, as well as in the Wood and Alexander Reader, are things like progress. I think Chasteen calls the first chapter post-colonial blues. So we're going to think about some of the reasons that Latin American nations had such a difficult time forming themselves. It wasn't just due to internal conflicts. Even if we think about the case of the United States or in the early republic, there were plenty of internal conflicts here. So that doesn't fully address the question of why Latin American nations got off on such unsure footing. More to do with that was the amount of foreign debt that Latin American nations owed to European countries as well as to the United States for helping them to gain their independence. So that help, that aid, came at a great cost. Also, the wars of independence damaged a lot of infrastructure. And so even though the liberal leaders of independence, people like Simón Bolívar, as we saw in Unit 2, desired big changes in terms of new rights for all of the people of their new countries, wider participation in a democratic form of government. All of these things were the ideals that these independence leaders held, but they were limited in great ways, and their ability to bring those things about were really stymied by what they owed to outside nations, as well as the kind of lingering structures of the colonial systems. So, for example, colonial America under Spanish rule and under Portuguese rule was very hierarchical, as Chasteen underscores. And so, out of the kind of, I guess we should say, the fires of independence came a kind of conservative turn back to seeing the problems, or I should say, recognize the problems of the independence era. And the shaky footing of these new nations. And so conservatives said, well, we'll bring back the old guard. We'll bring back what worked before and bring stability to our nations. As Chasteen points out, this is in part just sort of like a pendulum in terms of the political winds blowing back and forth. No one party that holds power for several decades can continue to please everyone. And so this does seem to be a predictable cycle in political systems worldwide in terms of their history, that they'll change and they'll kind of go from one side to the other over time. But there were a lot of reasons that liberalism really grew in the late 19th century. One of these main reasons was due to the advent of new technologies. So the technological advances that were promised by railroads, by mechanization, industrialization, these things promised to radically transform Latin American nations as they had been doing in Europe and the United States. So Latin American elites wanted to get involved with that, wanted to bring their nations into the modern age. And so to do so, they relied heavily on capital and intellectual property from Europe and the United States to get there. That meant that a new period of neocolonialism defined the latter section of the 19th century. As that word sounds, this was new colonialism for all intents and purposes. This time around, it wasn't the Spanish and the Portuguese violently conquering indigenous peoples and using conversions to the Christian faith and to European lifeways to take control of large areas of territory. Instead, this came through modern capitalism, through debt, through the imposition of foreign-owned corporations in Latin American nations. So as we leave this unit, the next topics that we'll come to, or the next topic that we come to, will be nationalism, which is kind of a response to neocolonialism, an effort to have Latin America for the Latin Americans. So Mexico for the Mexicans, Guatemala for the Guatemalans, and so on, meaning we want to control and own these companies so that the money and the benefits will go to the people of our country. So what I'm getting at with all of this is extreme inequality. Racial inequality, class inequalities really deepened during this period of time, despite the promises of liberal reformers to bring progress with a capital P through technology that would alleviate these problems, that would bring all people into more even footing. That wasn't the case. So we need to think about why. And so all of these forces that I've just talked about are things that caudillos who ruled a certain way, liberals and conservatives who will have to think about what those terms mean in the context of the mid-19th century, and the prophets of industrialism and the future. Those people all sought to create nations. They sought to build nations, and they sought to bring everyone on board with them. Meaning we want to convince everyone, from the poorest and the least included in real terms in actual practice to the most elite, into this idea that they belong in our nation. And so the guiding question then, in the context of everything I was just outlining, is asking us to think about how they did that. In the context of all of these problems and this complexity, how did political elites and economic elites in Latin America seek to build nations, and were they successful?